I'm part of and that we just got a couple of months ago. And so I don't have too much to show you in terms of some of the GIS work that we've been doing. A lot of that is just all very preliminary right now. But I'll just tell you a little bit about how I came to this work, and then show you one example of something that we're doing as part of one of the research clusters. I'm actually a sonic geographer as well. I did my PhD in sonic geographies of prisons. And so this work that I'm talking about today sounds very different from that, but my entry point into this project was that this group at Nipissing University was looking at different ways of telling stories about the land that they're on, which is in Northern Ontario, north of Lake Huron. And it's part of a treaty territory called Robinson-Huron Treaty. And that was written in 1850. So I came into it with this knowledge about sonic methodologies and sonic histories, and that was part of what they wanted to do with some of their mapping, was think about sound mapping and incorporating oral histories into some of the maps that they've done. And also working with some musicians as well. So that's something that we haven't really gotten into yet, but that's just to give you a sense of how I came into this work. I was just mentioning that I did live in Atlanta for a couple of years. So my interest in community-based work, it had already existed before that, but I was living there without working in the US. My partner was working at Georgia Tech. And I just got involved with the group out of Georgia State and Emory called ATL Maps. And that was really where I started to understand the potential of these large repositories of maps, and how you can kind of input historical data into those as well and tell stories in different ways. And so that's kind of another way that I came into this work as well, not really being someone who had done GIS or worked in cartography before. So I wanted to talk about this partnership development grant. There's a number of groups and people on this slide here that you can see. I'm working for Nipissing University at the bottom. Laurentian University is also a part of this project. It's another Northern Ontario university. So this grant is really trying to help bolster the work being done in smaller universities across Canada, particularly in Northern Ontario. And where I'm part of, I'm not sure if my mouse will show up here, but this group called CUSP, Center for Understanding Semi-Peripheries. And that's kind of recognizing this area around North Bay as a semi-periphery within Canada, that it's often been considered a quote, gateway to the north. And then in turn thinking about some of the indigenous lands on which that Nipissing University is situated as also considered semi-peripheral, but really trying to center those in our work. We're working with Nipissing First Nation, Doquis First Nation. Nipissing First Nation is about a 20-minute drive from the university, and Doquis First Nation is along the French River, so you have to go around Lake Nipissing, and it's about an hour and 20-minute drive or so. We're working with Chicago Field Museum, North Bay Museum, Ingenium, which is Canada's basically 3 major museums, national museums, including the Museum of Science and Technology, Agriculture, and I'm forgetting the other one. It might be the Military Museum.
Okay, I'm going to pause you just for a quick second.
Sure.
I'm going to say this. I didn't have the sound on right, and I think it'll work okay, but I'm going to do, for the rest of it, I'm going to do a better version of it.
Okay. Yeah.
Part 1, and then I'll merge them. Sorry. It's interesting, the Field Museum. I grew up in Chicago.
Oh, right.
There's no.
I'm actually recording this.
Oh, you are?
Yeah, I started maybe like 5 seconds in, but I got permission to record it, and it's recording, and it's going to the cloud.
Oh, well then we're talking to me. Well, we'll have a backup.
Okay. Sounds
perfect. Just what I want to hear, backups of my own voice.
Exactly.
Yeah, the Chicago Field Museum is, I can maybe get into this a little bit later, but they have a lot of the collection of ancestral remains that Franz Boas and a number of other people collected for the Chicago World's Fair. And those remains are actually from Doquis, they're ancestors of people from Doquis First Nation, and I believe Nipissing First Nation as well. So a lot of this work is centered around repatriation of cultural heritage objects, so thinking about the material objects of the land and the people that have lived on the land on which Nipissing sits, the university sits. So Chicago Field Museum is part of this partnership to think about how to return some of these objects carefully, reflexively, and they've been wonderful to work with so far. North Bay Museum as the local museum. So we have a number of different scales that we're operating at, especially with the museums. It's local, national, international. Just to give you a sense, maybe not the best map here, but of where we're talking about. This kind of area in red is obviously enlarged. Ingenium was formerly called Canada Science and Technology Museum. So that's in Ottawa. There's the Field Museum of Natural History. Laurentian University is nearby. It's about an hour away from Nipissing University. And then we have the two First Nations along Lake Nipissing and the French River down here. As part of this research, we also are, we're trying to base it in treaty relationships and trying to get people to really understand the land that they're on and thinking about these treaty histories. So this is a map. You can see, this is actually from Whitefish River First Nation. It's not our map, but this area in yellow is the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory. And that really, it really shows how a lot of these communities are very much connected historically through this treaty, but have kind of been separated out over time, but still very much share a lot of the same histories and land-based issues. So again, here's where we are in North Bay. Okay. I should also mention too that part of what this partnership development grant came out of, there isn't really one specific event or meeting, but Nipissing University and my supervisor, Kirsten Greer, who's a historical geographer, hosted an event called Challenging Canada 150. And that was in 2017. That was the Canada 150 celebrations were to mark Canada's birthday, 150th birthday or anniversary as a nation state. And of course, there were a lot of celebrations around this, but obviously, as we see on this land, 1850, for example, and way before, this land has existed much longer than 1867, and there are a lot of histories that kind of get erased in these 150th celebrations. So this conference was designed to get a conversation going about mostly issues around environmental change and climate change concerns, but putting that into the context of settler colonialism and the histories of settler colonialism in what's now Canada, what has been called Turtle Island across North America. Actually, I'll go back a second. So this conference brought together a number of Indigenous scholars and other community members, elders, knowledge keepers, children, water protectors, as well as other non-Indigenous scholars from a number of universities across Canada, but also I think many of you, or some of you might know Maria Lane, because I think she participated in the first community geography symposium. So University of New Mexico, we had people coming from the UK, and everyone was just kind of talking about issues around water, how do we use archives to rethink historical geographies, and also physical geographies as well. How do those kind of work together through this question about what is an archive? Is a tree an archive, for example? So that was where this sort of came out of, and we decided that we really needed to find some funding to keep those conversations going, particularly as so many acute issues are happening right now around flooding, water contamination, land encroachment, and other land claims, very serious legal issues that are happening right now around this land. So this is not the best image, but I was just trying to fit, this was from our original grant application. It's changed a lot since, and we have an artist in residence who's working on artistically representing the structure and the relationships that this grant is trying to strengthen. But just to give you a sense of some people, because I did want to mention that there are a number of individuals who have been really key for this work. Randy Rastool and Joan McLeod. Randy's from Doki's First Nation, Joan is from Nipissing First Nation. She's the former lands manager. And both Randy and Joan have been absolutely integral in this work. and they're kind of leading the way with deciding, helping, talking to their communities and deciding what they want to get out of this work, and then how can we help as academics and primarily as people who have access to funding. So as an academic, I'm mainly a facilitator for this type of work, but then if you look at this third cluster, I am the leader of one of the research clusters, which is critical historical soundscapes. So that's kind of where my work as a sonic geographer comes back in. But we've mainly been working on this first cluster, which is repatriating, decolonizing, indigenizing museum collections. And that's what I'll talk a little bit more about here. But I also wanted to mention our artist in residence at the bottom here, Elan Kuchi. She's, that's one of the things that we were so glad we could get this funding for, was trying to think about how to communicate scientific knowledge in a way that people who don't speak scientific knowledge would understand and would also appreciate more than trying to read an inaccessible article. And she's been developing a lot of different projects for us. That's very exciting. So I'll hopefully be able to update that at the AAG. Just to give you a sense of one of the things that she's helping with, and sort of an artistic representation of wampum, or of treaty-based histories, which is wampum. This was, these are a couple of wampum belts that were brought to that original symposium that I mentioned. And they aren't the ones that represent the territory that we were on, but this, for example, on the left is the Niagara Treaty. And so we have an artist in residence and who's working with a number of other people on the project to try to figure out how to sort of capture and represent the relationships that are happening through our partnership, and to put it down not just onto paper, but into a beaded belt. These are actually shells that create the wampum belt. And so each group within the partnership will get to choose their own symbol that will then become beaded into the belt. And we think that's really important because a lot of our research is, we're trying to shift away from these colonial practices and go back into research as ceremony, as treaty-based, and as wampum. I'll show you a couple of other pictures about that in a second. Some of the funding has already been secured. It had already been secured to create what they've called the Repatriation and Digitization, or RAD lab, at Nipissing University. This actually isn't the lab, but this is an example of one of the workshops that come out of the lab, and it's open to the public to learn about how to create your own story maps through ESRI, for example. This is Megan Prescott. She's the GIS technician and a former student of Kirsten Greer's. She's been amazing to work with. This is Randy Restool on the bottom sort of left corner. He's the one that I had mentioned is one of the project directors. So some of the things that we wanted to do with this partnership, part of it is to, like, how do we take account of the stories that have already been told about this land, or specifically that around Lake Nipissing and the French River, but also what kinds of stories and people have been silenced in that process. And so we had a number of different objectives that we wanted to get out of this. And with the first research cluster that I'll talk about, it was very much about first establishing a partnership between First Nations communities, universities, and museums to think about how to repair a lot of broken relationships that have occurred through different kinds of colonial violence, but also through the creation of Western scientific knowledge systems. But also to just sort of document and provide an inventory of the kinds of items and objects that have already been stolen or taken without really much explanation, and where those objects even are, like which museums they're in. So we're kind of mapping those out right now and trying to map the movements of a lot of those collectors that brought those items to these different museums or sold them. Because there's a lot of gaps in that knowledge. Often, for those of you who do archival research, you can probably relate to this idea that you'll show up and you'll see a collector's name, but it won't say where they collected something from, or you'll see the location, but you don't know who the collector is. So if we can start to map these out, we can try to figure some of that out. and then provide this inventory as like a base to figure out where to go from there.
That's kind of a like turning the camera around kind of moment. Of,
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. And I think
turning around the colonial gaze.
Yeah. And I think also repairing a lot of our own disciplinary histories of oppression and of taking things, Franz Boas is often cited as an anthropologist, but he's also a geographer. And so as geographers, just recognizing our own lineage coming out of people like Franz Boas, how do we repair some of those damages, whether those were intended or unintended? The fact is that they have led to a lot of trauma and pain. And so thinking about reparation, land reparation is obviously a major topic right now, but not only thinking of it as how do we give land back to the people that it was taken from, but what are the objects that also were taken from that land and that represent that land and are very, very spiritually important and culturally significant. So how do we return some of those items, and what are the challenges and ethics of that as well? So that's one of the reasons we went to the Smithsonian, the Museum of American Indian, and that was actually during the AAG. So that was when I met you, at least you, Jerry.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure if I met you, Eileen, there.
I don't think Eileen was at that one, but
right. So I just sort of was sneaking into the AAG. I was really there to go and help with repatriation consultation with a couple of graduate students from Nipissing University and my supervisor, Kirsten Greer. And I just wanted to mention that at the start of this, we were going to see some of the objects that we know are from Nipissing and Doquis First Nation. And because a lot of this research, we're trying to consider it as ceremony and reintegrate ceremony into the process, we started the day with a sunrise ceremony that always takes place at the water. It's not the most beautiful picture here. That was just the closest one that we could find right behind the AAG hotel.
Yeah.
And so it was Kirsten Greer, Meg Paulin, and Keithan Sutherland. And Meg is Mi'kmaq, but has also a lot of familial connections to Nipissing First Nation. And Keithan is Cree. So part of this work wasn't just looking at items from Nipissing and Anishinaabe. It was also looking at some that were collected around James Bay. Here's just some photographs of what happened once we got there. So we did, before this, we did a smudging ceremony, and we also called in to a number of community members that couldn't be there. So Randy Rastool, Elan Kuchi, Cindy Pelche, who are all involved in the project. They were there in various forms on Skype and FaceTime. So this was part of it, was just starting to document. We know that these items exist, but to also take pictures of them, to touch them and feel them, and try to better understand what might be brought back and how. And to figure out how to bring them back in a way that will help to decolonize that process of the museums. Doquis First Nation has its own museum. They have a lot of, it's fantastic. They have a lot of space. They have the capacity to store these items and to protect them, but also to think about, do these all have to go back into a museum, and how might they be brought back into the community in a way that the community themselves decide? So in some cases, to put some of these items back into use. This is a picture of Keithan looking at some of the items from his homeland, and that includes, he was actually translating some words, some of the Cree symbols. It was really great to see, and something the museum didn't have either, so kind of giving back to Smithsonian too. From there, we went to the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. Just really quickly, I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures here, because part of this research, as I mentioned, is mapping the movements of the collectors and also mapping out the objects and items that they collected. In some cases, those might be birds. That's a bit harder to map unless you know exactly where they were shot down or killed. But that also can help give us a sense of where, if we know that a collector has a particular type of bird that is only in one area within Canada, then we can start to figure out where exactly they went from there.
Are you going back to like their journals and stuff too?
Yeah, so this one on the right, that we are looking through a lot of the collectors' journals, their field notes, which have been really helpful. The issue there is that those aren't digitized. So one of the things that we're hoping to do with a future grant is to get graduate students or community members and pay them to go and digitize whatever they think is important for their work and for ours.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about just a couple of conclusions that I have with doing this type of work, because, as I mentioned, this is really preliminary right now. The first one, though, is that I've done community work before, but I've never done something like this that is so deeply complex and emotional, because some of the remains that we're talking about are from young people, like a 4-year-old girl at the Chicago Field Museum, and there's very little information about her other than being able to use dental records to try to figure out who this person might have been. But to think about that emotional effect of actually going to see some of these objects, which I didn't actually see those, Kirsten has. Another example of that is that when we were at the Carnegie Museum, we just happened to go through one of the collector's books, and I can't remember whose it was, but on the acknowledgements page was a photograph, and this happened to be, a great grandfather or a great uncle of some of our partners, like some of the actual people that are in our partnership, and it just happened to be one of the guides taking this explorer collector up north through Northern Ontario. And so just that impact of you see very real effects and legacies that these people have created. So that's one of the things. And land, I think I had mentioned this before, but recognizing that land is at the heart of this partnership. So a lot of what's coming out of this are educational resources and digitization practices that still recognize the importance of being on the land. So part of it has been going out on traditional ecological knowledge walks or medicinal plant walks, and really learning a lot about the history of land that I've been on for a long time as someone who's always lived on the land of, at least for a long time, of the Anishinaabe, but not really understanding what was actually under my feet and the cultural and environmental significance of that. I think that this is really an opportunity to think about how we might decolonize research partnerships, and recognizing that most of our institutions, at least Western institutions and knowledge systems, are deeply entrenched in colonial histories of violence and stolen land and stolen knowledges and erasure, silencing, and that sort of thing. So really trying to part of the reason this is taking so long is just how many steps back we have to take to try to figure out how to not approach this in a way that reproduces the negative effects of settler colonialism. And in some cases that means saying, here's part of the grant funds, go and do what you want with it, and don't even tell us. If in some cases it might be that people are trying to find plants again that are really significant for medicinal value and cultural value, but are sacred knowledge. And so as a settler academic, I don't have to know that information. We do have to have a general sense of how money is being spent, of course, to report back to SSHRC, but I think a lot of this is that some knowledge I don't deserve to hear and don't have to hear. And that's just part of the learning process.
So can I ask with that, because one of the things I've been thinking some in terms of the larger framing of what community geography is this notion of kind of the institutional transformations that have to happen for these kinds of partnerships to happen. So for both SSHRC as your funder or for the university, what kind of negotiation did you have to do to kind of, because like I was in a project where we tried to do something similar, not quite in the same kind of settler colonialism kind of framework, but to give money to communities kind of do what they want with it. And it was difficult in terms of, because understandably, there's some degree they want to make sure there's accountability on how that money's spent. But how did you all negotiate that? Or did you have to? Was it pretty straightforward?
Well, in some cases, the funding models have changed a bit. One of the things that's reminding me of is how the language of the funding in Canada is still, like, it still hasn't caught up to this push towards decolonization and indigenization.
Mm-hmm.
But they're willing to fund those types of projects, but the language of even just the drop-down menus still not really recognizing that Indigenous people can also be scholars, that they're not just part of the vulnerable populations that are being studied. And so there's this disconnect there that's really interesting with Canada had released their Truth and Reconciliation calls to action about four years ago. And part of that was that we have to do much more in terms of funding these types of projects, and not in a way that doesn't just place the money in academics' hands. So there are there's not, with SSHRC at least in particular, there's not too much oversight from SSHRC. We have to provide a report once a year, but they're a lot less strict in terms of following up on how exactly that money was spent. And we were right up front, because it also, in this partnership development grant, the whole point is to get out of the university and to create partnerships with non-academic institutions. So within that grant, they do allow for stipends for basically up to half of a person's salary that's not associated with the university.
Oh, okay.
So that's why when you saw that project co-directors page, none of those people were from the universities.
Mm-hmm.
It allows us to pay them
not a small amount of money.
A substantial amount of money to allow them to take the time that they need to work on this partnership. But then that also gives them, in theory, the freedom to kind of take their funds and use them how they would like. Mm-hmm. And then of course there's other parts of the funding for, like, supplies and the digitization lab too. So
I think a little more straightforward.
Yeah, it's definitely more it's more open to those kinds of, hopefully, decolonization practices than other SSHRC grants are. But there's still a long way to go with that. I should also mention too that Nipissing University is probably a leader, is a leader in thinking about decolonization and indigenization. There's a lot of theoretical work around those topics coming out of the university. There's a lot of, it's already embedded in a lot of community-based research before I got there, and before these calls to action even happened. And so I think that's a really positive thing. The president is also an Indigenous person, and that's the first president of a university that is in Canada. So that's part of the context as well. So the next steps right now is that I had mentioned that Challenging Canada 150 symposium. We've just received funding to create a second one, which is going to happen. It's not called Challenging Canada 150 anymore. It's going to just still be around environmental histories and historical geographies, but it's happening adjacent to the American Society for Environmental History conference, which is in Ottawa. And there's a lot of connections between the First Nations communities that whose land Ottawa is sitting on. And so what we've received funding for is to create the second symposium, which is primarily going to be led by Indigenous scholars and community members, to think about, there's going to be 4 circle sessions. So even just thinking about changing the structure of our meetings from one person talking to a group that's sitting in lines to sitting in a circle, passing an eagle feather around and talking, or a talking stick. And talking about just around a particular theme. So it could be water, it could be land claims that are very much ongoing right now for many of these communities. And so there's going to be sacred fires happening at the same time, Indigenous catering, and just really trying to challenge what has predominantly been a very white settler conference of environmental historians. So it'll be happening at the same time and in conversation with that conference on the same grounds. We're also creating a book right now that is a series of reflections and papers based on that original symposium. And that's one of the things that I'm kind of helping lead there. It's been a lot of herding cats. I think that's one thing that I would love to talk more about with this community geography group, is how just the logistics of trying to get so many people to communicate with each other, especially as someone who is living in a different place than the work that I'm doing. So just in future meetings, I want to throw that out there, or maybe at the AAD, talking a little bit more about how to, like, who is doing this successfully, because it's really challenging to, just to do work over email and then meet up as a group once every few months maybe, and just hope that everyone's kind of off doing their own thing, and we'll all create something together at some point. But yeah, I think I'm not sure. I've probably talked for a long time here. We're almost done, so I think I'll just end it there. Maybe with also just referring back to that repatriation and digitization lab as a site that is really important for educating not just people at Nipissing University, but creating a more public-facing platform that eventually we're trying to get more user-friendly and allowing people to just take whatever's already in the system and create their own stories with that, their own maps, and that can be for their own communities or that can go up publicly. Right now, there's a really important case around annuities with Doki's First Nation and the Robinson Huron Treaty territory. I won't go into that, but just to say that something like this lab can help produce a lot of different ways of representing land and representing timber sales and land encroachment that can then be used in some of these court cases as well. And people like Randy Restool, he's created some GIS platform around that land encroachment. So starting to see some very real impacts of this type of partnership, and looking forward to figuring out where we'll go from there.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm at right now. And I realize we don't have people for questions, but happy to answer.
People can contact you, because we'll post this, but people can contact you via email or Twitter. Yeah, Twitter's been really useful, actually. It's really frustrating sometimes to be on Twitter, but at the same, that's basically Twitter in a nutshell. Yeah, really frustrating. But at the same time, for this type of work, it's been incredibly valuable as another form of community building. There's a strong community that's a number of communities over Twitter, but one of them is kind of hashtag native Twitter, and that's not something I'm part of as a settler, but I've learned so much from the Indigenous communities that really share most of what they've learned over Twitter rather than through, academic papers or something. So I just thought I should mention that Twitter has probably been one of the most valuable resources for this type of work, even though it can just be a rabbit hole and a source of frustration too. Right. No, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. I mean, this sounds really awesome. It sounds like no problem. Yeah. Project. Hopefully Eileen, sorry, go ahead. Well, just in the future, I'll have just more permission to show some of the maps as well that they're creating. Most of the partners right now are at, I think they're Kitigan-Zibi Reserve to talk about this conference in Ottawa that I was just mentioning. Yeah. So they're offline right now, but I appreciate all the work that they've done too. Yeah. Eileen, did you have any questions?
I didn't have questions. I was just going to say this is so incredibly cool. I love learning about what people do, and this is just really awesome. I'm just in awe of what people are doing and work with Indigenous peoples too. Thanks. That's nice of you to say. It's been fun, and I really want to reiterate that this is I'm just one tiny part of this huge project, and I came into it a little bit later, but it's been great to see the very unexpected directions it's gone in. Yeah, that's cool. Well, thanks. You can probably stop recording, Eileen. I'll stop on my end.
I'm sorry we didn't have a